Hi, I'm Dr. Elli Brickwood. I am course leader for the Primary Education with QTS course here at the University of Huddersfield. I'm also ADHD and autistic, and that's a really big focus of my research work and work in schools. So I've worked in mainstream schools for around about 18 years. I've worked in an alternative provision with a lot of children with additional needs that were neurodivergent. So I want to talk to you a little bit about neurodiversity, what neurodiversity is, some of the language around that, and then a little bit about neurodiversity-affirming culture and how you can develop that in your classrooms. So starting with the language, neurodiversity, you've probably heard the word a lot. Neurodiversity really talks about the diversity in which not just brains work, but the way in which the children in your class, the learners in your classroom, will work in a variety of different ways, a diversity of ways. So, for example, a child may communicate in one way, another child may communicate in a different way. It's basically the diversity of that. So it's the diversity of the population. There's often confusion between the word neurodiversity and neurodivergence. So neurodivergence comes about when a learner or an individual diverges, the way they work diverges significantly from what we would call the norm. Now, the norm is obviously impacted by lots of different things, cultures, society, where that setting is. But without worrying about it too much, what it really means, neurodivergence, is often that they have significant barriers to learning in the same way as other learners who don't have those barriers. Now, there's some other language that comes along with neurodivergence and neurodiversity that you've probably heard about. You'll know that neurodivergence is, autism, ADHD, Down syndrome, because that's working in a different way. But we also often hear phrases such as low functioning and high functioning. One of the things with the neurodiversity affirming framework or culture is avoiding use of those terms. Using phrases such as high functioning or low functioning, it's really difficult to sort of see what they mean. For example, as an academic in university, as a teacher for many years who is ADHD and autistic, I would be seen as high functioning. However, what you don't see is that my high functioning in a space, in an area of education, takes a lot of work that it possibly wouldn't take somebody else who isn't ADHD autistic. It means that I have to prepare differently. It means that I have to recover differently. So that high functioning and low functioning is what you see on the outside, not what's actually happening. So avoiding terms like that. It's also avoiding phrases that are deficit views. So saying what we can't do as neurodivergent learners. So, communication issues instead of communicates differently would be a much better way of putting it. Can't read instead of has a barrier to reading words on white print, for example. So if we can avoid those sorts of negative terms, those deficit viewpoints, actually what we're building towards is a neurodiversity affirming culture. So creating a culture in our classrooms, in our education spaces, where neurodivergent and neurodiversity is affirmed. In a neurodiversity affirming culture in education, what we're looking at is trying to create a space where all learners can thrive. So to do that, we need to think about things to do with neurodivergence and the traits that come along with it. Now, we've had a chat with some learners earlier on today about their neurodivergence, and they spoke about the fact that actually some of the key areas are around relationships. So educators knowing the learners in your class is absolutely key. It's a key to all education, but particularly for our neurodivergent learners, because they may have experienced things in society and life in general that may make them feel very disconnected. So building relationships with our neurodivergent learners and making sure we know what suits them. It's not a magic wand. It's not going to make everything better, because there are other things we have to think about, and there are other things mentioned by the young people this morning, things about sensory issues. So we know from research that neurodivergent learners experience sensory stimuli in a different way from neurotypical learners. So, for example, there may be sounds, there may be feelings that are physically painful to a neurodivergent learner that a neurotypical learner might not even notice. So then, you might ask, how do I deal with that then? If I, as a neurotypical learner or a neurodivergent who's different from another neurodivergent, can't experience it, how can I help them? How can I make it different? And it's right back to relationships. If you have a relationship with a neurodivergent learner where they feel they can say, oh, this is really loud in here, or it's really bright in here, sometimes you might be able to do something about it. Other times, it's just enough that they're able to say it and express their needs. So 2 key things there, thinking about relationships, thinking about sensory needs, and coming along with the sensory needs, that's about knowing about neurodivergence and the traits that come along with that. Because there's more than sensory needs, but I could go through tons, but it's not appropriate, because what's appropriate are the needs of your learner. So learning about neurodivergence as it applies to your learners, those are the key things in building a neurodiversity-affirming culture in your classroom. So 1, get to know your learners, build relationships. 2, think about the sensory environment, think about meeting the needs of all your learners through that. And number 3, learning about neurodivergence. Those are 3 key things that can make a huge difference for neurodivergent and neurodiverse learners. So why neurodiversity-affirming practice? In your classrooms, in your education spaces, you are likely to have learners who have a diagnosis, okay, if they're very lucky and have got through the waiting lists. The whole point of a neurodiversity-affirming practice is that it doesn't just meet the needs of our neurodivergent learners, it also meets the needs of all learners. That's why it's neurodiversity-affirming, not neurodivergence-affirming. So if you've got people waiting on huge waiting lists for diagnosis, it can meet their needs. If you've got somebody who's not even touched on a diagnosis, again, it can meet their needs because it's neurodiversity affirming. It's meeting all learners' needs. An example would be a child might work better with a timer. So actually, it's quite difficult to then put a timer on the desk and it supports that one learner only. But if a teacher can put a timer on the board for everybody, it's not going to hinder everybody. It's going to help those who need to use it. Very similar area to think about here that's much hotly debated within lots of classrooms are the use of things such as fidget tools or sensory, sitting on a ball maybe, or being able to fidget during classroom time. Lots of debate around it, and much of the debate around it is, okay, it might be good for one learner, but they might distract others with it, or they might use a fidget tool, for example, inappropriately. There's also the idea that actually a fidget tool solves all problems, okay? Now, there's lots of research around it, but much of the research around fidget tools has expected them to make our neurodivergent or neurodiverse learners work in a neurotypical way. So we're not giving children a fidget tool so that they sit still and make great eye contact and can then do everything that we would expect a neurotypical child to show us that they're concentrating. Generally, they do help concentration because they give somebody who is a neurodivergent the capacity to do 2 things at the same time, which actually is much better for lots of neurodivergent learners. But there's so much to think about that's more than that. It's the type of fidget tool. It's the okay. It's the fact that they're allowed to use a fidget tool actually makes them feel valued and is more likely to help them to work better. It's the fact that actually they need to choose when to use the fidget tool. It's not provided as a reward for completing 5 sums, for example. And in terms of, everybody will want one. Well, everybody might want a fidget tool, but those children who don't need a fidget tool will soon get bored of them, and it will just be those children who actually need them that use them. A great example of this in practice is I went in to visit a school, lots of children with fidget tools, one little boy not using a fidget tool but staring into the bottle of his bottle and fidgeting with his bottle. He'd obviously turned down any offer of fidget toys, and the class teacher said to me, I know he's listening because I've spoken to him about understanding. Didn't need a fidget toy, didn't need a fidget tool because they weren't what met his needs, but the bottle, looking into that, worked. And it allowed him to be able to concentrate. It also allowed him to be himself, which is key in a classroom. If you want learners to learn. I went into a classroom, another student was teaching, and in the classroom, the little boy had in place that when he was feeling dysregulated, he was allowed to pick up a book and read his book. He didn't have to say anything to the teacher, he could stop his work and read his book. Now that's trusting that actually he's only going to do it when he's dysregulated. But what happened in that classroom is if he picked up his book and started reading, the teacher would go across and say, "Do you need any help?" And he would either answer or not answer, it didn't matter. The teacher would move away, and then the child would carry on reading, and when he was regulated, he'd put the book down. And then he'd get back on with his work, and the teacher would go across and support him. But not only has that child then able to do his work, but he's also learnt a regulation skill that will stick with him for the rest of his life. If he's on a bus somewhere and he's a little bit dysregulated, he's learnt a skill to do that. He's also learnt what dysregulation and regulation feels like. Because with our younger learners, the biggest thing is that actually they might not know that they're dysregulated. So we have to teach them actually about regulation, but we also have to allow them to learn about it by giving them those spaces. I think learning about neurodivergence is essential, but then assuming that those traits are the same for every neurodivergent is huge. That can be really negative. For example, assuming that a neurodivergent learner always needs something broken down into smaller chunks of learning. If you break anything mathematical or pattern spotting down into smaller chunks of learning for me, I will give up on you and I will be bored. Okay? So trying to apply things just because they're a neurodivergent trait or they might be a neurodivergent trait to that learner in front of you is not going to work. It's learning about the traits and then learning about how they work for that child. But then also, I guess part of that is assuming that those things don't change. Now, they change in neurotypical children, but they change even more significantly in neurodivergent learners. For example, a neurodivergent learner who hasn't slept very well is likely to have a very different way of working to when they have slept very well. Yes, it's the same for a neurotypical child, but it's even more significant for neurodivergent learners. So I think making assumptions about I've got to make it easier because they're not going to be able to do that is a biggie, or making assumptions that they won't always be able to do things, or that they will always be able to do it because they did it yesterday. Why can't they today?